All right, welcome. It's good to be with you guys again. I applaud you guys for your diligence and showing up on a cold January night. It helps me when I have an audience and faces to get a little feedback for what I am saying. Martin Luther is probably my favorite figure from the history of Western civilization, and I can make the case that he might be the most important figure in the history of Western civilization. Several of my graduate school professors asserted that there were more books written about Martin Luther than about any other historical figure other than Jesus. And the biographers of Napoleon beg to disagree, but I think Luther actually probably, especially if you count in all the other languages. So he is sometimes touted as the first modern man. And we'll talk a little bit about in what sense that might be true. But welcome once again to the Schaeffer Study Center monthly community lecture. I've got a couple of fun images of Luther here in his various guises. Viva la Reformación, and Luther disguised as Knight Georg. So again, just a reminder about the Francis Schaeffer Study Center, which is sponsoring these community lectures. Founded 21 years ago, and our mission is to promote a biblical worldview through the study of history, literature, and art. And in addition to doing these lectures, we also run a high school program that meets on Wednesdays and an elementary school program that meets on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And if you want to know more about that, please visit our website. I'm Rob Shearer. I've been married for 47 years now, coming up on 48 later on this year. We have 12 children, 3 sons, 9 daughters. At this point, 21 grandchildren, 9 boys and 12 girls. My undergraduate degree is from Davidson College in North Carolina. I have a master's from Stanford University. I'm a trained professional historian. But I've been a teacher. Teaching has been my calling. I do spend some time writing. I've been a college professor. I was city manager. I'm still publishing some books from time to time. And along with my wife, I'm co-director of the Francis Schaeffer Study Center. And I love traveling with students. That's a trip that we made. That's in the Vatican Museum in the Stanza Raffaello, the famous fresco of Raphael of the School of Athens. And that's me wearing the red hat, of course. So I still do that from time to time. So help me get started. What's one thing you already know about Martin Luther?
He liked beer.
He liked beer. Das ist wahr. That's true.
There's 92 theses on it.
Oh, the 95 Theses. Yep, very important. Yep, we'll talk about those.
Was a Catholic priest.
Was a Catholic priest. Yes, he was. Ordained, celebrated a mass, and with fear and trembling, and his father was not impressed. But yeah, not only a monk, but ordained. No? Anything else? Any other little tidbits? All right. Well.
Salvation by faith.
Yeah, salvation by faith. The solus, salvation by faith alone. Sola fide, sola gratia, sola deo gloria. That's the 3, sometimes expanded to 5. Okay, so who was he? He wasn't always slightly rotund. He was, in fact, that slender, as he's portrayed in the movie. He did become a monk. He dropped out of law school. He was not planning on a career in the church. He was originally going to university in order to become a lawyer, and dropped out of law school, became a monk, and from there, I'll talk a bit about how he got there, but eventually he's a professor of theology. We'll talk about the 95 Theses, we'll talk about why he was excommunicated, how Christianity changed, and the influence that he still has. So here are sort of the important dates from his early life. He's born in 1483 in Eisleben. His parents were upper middle class. They were not poor. Sometimes his father is portrayed as a poor miner. And he was not the guy who went down in the mine with the pickaxe and came out every day with a bucket full of coal. He, in fact, owned several tin and copper mines, and they did reasonably well. The house that he lived in as a child is still standing in Eisleben, and his parents could afford to send him to private school. He got an education at schools run by the Brethren of the Common Life, and they emphasized learning the classics of the ancient world, studying Latin. Greek was not yet very familiar, but in the late 1480s and early 1490s, there was a revival of humanist learning and a revival of interest in the classics of Republican Rome. And Luther mastered classical Latin. It was a requirement to enter the university, and only a small percentage of the population attended university, and to be admitted, you had to be fluent in classical Latin. You did all of your courses and lectures and reading, and if you did a dissertation, it was written in Latin. He dropped out. He got a BA. He got an MA from the University of Erfurt, and he was beginning on his study of the law. His father spent quite a handy sum of money to buy him a copy of the textbook that he would use for 2 or 3 years, the Justinian Codex, the compilation of all the Roman court decisions arranged topically, and it was a huge multi-volume thing. It probably cost about the price of a small car. It was probably $5,000 or $10,000, used car. And he was on his way home from Erfurt back to Eisleben and got caught in one of the rare thunderstorms that sometimes hits Middle Europe. They're rarer there than they are here. And there was lightning striking all around him, and it terrified him. He was crossing an open field, and there were lightning bolts that he could see hitting the ground, and he threw himself down on the ground. He tells the story himself, and said, "Help me, St. Anne, I will become a monk." St. Anne is the patron saint of miners. They said, "Help me, St. Anne, I will become a monk." And the storm passed, and he went back to the university. You got to think there was more going on than just that one thunderstorm. But he went back to the university. He sold the books. He had a farewell dinner with his friends, and then he entered the Augustinian monastery. The monastery is still there. We went in and out the door where he entered. And he was very quickly recognized by the head of the order, who actually was at the monastery that he had chosen to enter, Johannes Staupitz. He was the head of all the Augustinian houses in Germany. And he recognized that this guy was something special. He was obsessive about confessing his own sins to the point of being annoying. There's a line from the movie which Luther actually records. He would make confession to Staupitz, who was the abbot and the head of the monastery. And as he was leaving, he would remember something that he had not confessed, and he would turn around and want to go back and amend his confession and add something. And Staupitz eventually said, "Brother Martin, you've been here several years now. I've been hearing your confession every week. Not once have you confessed to anything remotely interesting." But it didn't stop him. Staupitz sent him back to the university and said, "You need to be ordained, and you need to get a doctorate in theology, because we need Augustinian monks who can teach." Staupitz himself had a doctorate in theology and taught for several years at a new university in Saxony, in the capital of electoral Saxony, in Wittenberg. Wittenberg was a little town. The university was very young. Staupitz was the first professor of theology there, and the university only had a half a dozen professors at that point, and maybe 100 students. But he's sort of grooming Luther as his protege to follow him and to take over the teaching duties at the university in Wittenberg. So here's the monastery in Erfurt. It's still standing. It's now owned by the Lutheran Church, no longer a Catholic monastery. They use it as a retreat center. You can actually stay in the former monks' cells, which I arrange for my students to do when we travel. There's an overhead plan. So there were probably 100 monks there with their own church. and beautiful courtyards and such. So Luther is ordained as a priest. He completes his doctorate, and Staupitz sends him to Wittenberg. And he's been teaching there for about 5 years, and something happens in Germany that prompts him to do something a little out of the ordinary for a professor of the Bible, a professor of theology, and that is to put up a public list of debating points. It's the sale of indulgences. We'll talk more about that here in a minute. He eventually, of course, after being outlawed, kidnapped, hidden, coming back to Wittenberg, he marries a former nun, Katharina von Bora. As the monks were leaving their monasteries, Luther eventually decided that the monastic orders really had no biblical justification. And so his influence led to many, many monasteries in many of the parts of Germany just closing down and the monks returning to their families. And there was an abbey with nuns where the young ladies, those who had families who would take them, returned to them, but there were a group of 6 who escaped because there was still an abbess who was keeping strict track of all the nuns and wasn't letting them leave. They escaped. They came to Wittenberg looking for shelter. Luther and his fellow leaders in the church there arranged for marriages for 5 of the 6. They had one older noblewoman. She was actually 26, I think, so not that old. And he was 42. Anyway, they had one student who agreed that he would like to be married, and she agreed, and then he went home to his family, and they said, absolutely not, you can't marry a nun. They wouldn't let him come back to Wittenberg. So that engagement fell through, and Katharina von Bora finally came to Luther and said, I'd be willing to marry either you or one of the other theology professors. And Luther thought about that for a minute and said, okay, let's get married. So she kind of proposed to him. Again, she's 26, he's 42. They had 6 children. 1522, he published the New Testament in German. 1534, he published the entire Bible in German. And I've got facsimile editions over here. That's the New Testament, same size as the original, just the New Testament books. And then these 2 volumes together are the 1534 full Bible. It took him 12 years to get from just the New Testament to all of the Old Testament books because, of course, he had to master Hebrew. He had already mastered Greek to translate directly from Greek into German. He had to master Hebrew, and he had a group of 6 or 7 scholars who helped him. They circulated draft translations, but he was the final reviser of all of those. So he's a university graduate. He's an Augustinian monk. He's a professor of theology. Oh, by the way, the town council asked him to take over duties as the pastor of the town church. So he preaches every Sunday to the town folk. He's district supervisor for 5 Augustinian monasteries in the region around Wittenberg. He's an author, an essayist. He's a translator, and after 1525, he's a husband and a father. And the Elector of Saxony gave him the former Augustinian monastery in Wittenberg for his personal residence. And one of my favorite stories about him is typical academic bachelor lifestyle. The rooms, they put straw down, to sort of cover the stone floors because it's less hard on the feet and makes the room a little warmer and all of that. So, but after a while, the straw gets dirty, and rather than just sweeping and vacuuming, you toss the straw out, put new straw down. Well, Luther couldn't be bothered with all of that. So when a room and the straw got old and stale and started to rot and whatever, he would just move to the next cell. So he'd been through about half the cells in the monastery when he and Katie got married, and Katie said, oh, no, this will not do. So she cleaned everything up. They wound up with a household with 6 kids and servants, a cook, several maids, And there's a famous architectural feature on the outside of the monastery called Katie's Door, because she didn't like the monastery's layout. She wanted a proper front door on the front side of the building, and there wasn't one next to the staircase. And so the story that's told is that he came home from lecturing at the university, which is just about a mile down the road from where the monastery is, and there's 4 or 5 guys with sledgehammers knocking a hole in the wall and constructing a door. And he says, what is going on? And Katie said, "That's the door you gave me for my birthday." She was his match. There's a lot of Katie that's quite interesting. This is the Weimar edition of Luther's works. These volumes began to be published in 1883, and it took them over 100 years to get his entire corpus of writing into print. It's in 72 volumes. His letters, his correspondence is in 18 volumes. The German Bible are 15 volumes of that. And then there's the Table Talk. Katie turned the old monastery into a boarding house for students because it was a way to supplement their income. So she rented out rooms and provided both room and board. And there was a large meal every day for the household. And Dr. Luther came home from the university from his lectures and the students, and they all had a meal together. And he would sort of hold court at the end of the big table with everybody and make pronouncements and observations about politics and scientific affair. We have his comments about Copernicus and his theories that were being circulated and whether the Earth went around the sun or not, about the discovery of new peoples and lands in the New World. Luther talks about that. The students actually began taking notes of what he said at these noontime meals, transcribing his observations. We have 6 volumes of what are called the Table Talk, which is basically stuff Luther said over lunch. Here's the real interesting thing. If you want to write a biography of Luther, this is your source material. And my graduate advisor at Stanford advised me, because I was contemplating doing something with Luther when I was in grad school there, and he said, you have to make a choice. Anybody who wants to tackle Luther and write a biography of him, you can either spend your life reading all the stuff that Luther wrote, or you can spend your life writing a biography of him, but you won't live long enough to do both. And it's actually even worse than that, because Luther is a 3rd-generation Renaissance humanist. He is trained in classical Latin, Cicero and Augustine. He writes a very elegant Latin style, although he can be pretty direct and blunt and earthy when he wants to be. He's good at doing insults in any language. He also learned ancient Greek so that he could read the manuscripts of the Greek New Testament and translate from them. And then he also learns Hebrew. He not only reads these languages, he writes letters in these languages. So those collected 18 volumes of his correspondence, they're letters in Latin and letters in German and letters in New Testament Greek, and there's some letters in Hebrew that he's just, it's kind of like, I guess using a code where only those in the know can discern. It's not completely secret because obviously there are a number of people who can read Hebrew, but it's a small circle. Melanchthon, who was one of his fellow professors at the university, was the nephew of Johannes Reuchlin, who published the first Hebrew dictionary in German. So Luther comes by all of this honestly, but he is a Renaissance humanist. There's Wittenberg. That's it. That's the whole town. It was a little tiny village of about approximately 3,000 people in the 1520s on the banks of the Elbe River. The Elbe is just below this picture. They have the soccer fields and the floodplain there. This is the old city with the walls. There's the Augustinian monastery. There's the town church, city hall, and the square. There's the elector's castle and the elector's church, and that's where the university lectures were held. That's the whole town. And so when Luther goes to work from the Augustinian monastery, it's about a mile. He walks down this one main street to the elector's castle, where there are rooms where he can give his lectures. And then at lunchtime, he takes a break and he walks back, and Katie will have fixed a big sumptuous feast for all the students. And then if he has an afternoon lecture, he'll walk back to the elector's castle and give an afternoon lecture. And that's pretty much his life. He's a university professor and the pastor of the town. He preaches every Sunday at the St. Mary's Church, which is the town church there. By the way, on this corner here, there's a pub called Zum Schwarzen Bär, the Black Bear, at the Black Bear. Luther writes about the pub. At one point, he writes kind of a humorous anecdote. He says, I had nothing to do with the Reformation. I was sitting in the pub, I was sitting in the Black Bear drinking beer. It all happened due to something the Holy Spirit did out there. I was not involved. I was in the pub drinking beer. I was in the Black Bear. There's a Luther Ecke. There's a Luther corner in the Black Bear. The upper part of the building is now a hotel, and the first floor has the pub. That's where my students and I stay when we go to Wittenberg. It's right there on the Hunt. We're halfway between the Castle Church and the Augustinian Monastery. So when the 95 Theses are nailed up, inviting public debate about the practice of selling indulgences, it's on the door of the Castle Church, which is like the university bulletin board. It's not an attack on the church, it's just a posting, hey, all of you students, anybody else on the faculty who's interested in this topic, I'm going to hold a public discussion about the practice of selling indulgences, and here are 95 propositions that I think we should talk about. I don't know how long that debate would have happened, and there's no record that it ever actually happened. In fact, some people actually dispute whether he nailed it up on the door, but that's the story that has come down. This is St. Mary's, that's the city church. This is the square. This is me in a red hat. This is the bulletin board at the city church. This is bulletin board right here. The Stadtkirche Gemeinde. That's the city church congregation, because Germans love doing compound words. So Stadtkirche Gemeinde. That's all the things going on at the church there. We know what courses he taught. Better than that, we have his notes for the courses that he taught. He was using, by 1515, he was using Erasmus's Greek New Testament. We have his copy with his notes in the margin. And so each of those books was the subject of a year's worth of lectures. He spent the whole academic year just doing the Psalms. And then he spent the whole academic year just teaching his students about the book of Romans. Now, medieval University of Wittenberg, that meant verse by verse, not just looking at what Paul said, but looking at what all of the church fathers had said about that verse over the centuries. All the various interpretations and controversies and debates that had been held in the history of the church. So Luther has read the church fathers. And the church father that he's most familiar with, because he is the one most often quoted in the collection of sentences, theological references, is Augustine. At the medieval university, if you were going to study theology, the author that you would find most often cited by everybody is Augustine. So he has Augustine as his guide for all of this, and we know he's looking at the Greek manuscript. He's not only now teaching his students about what the Latin Vulgate verse means and what the church fathers over the medieval centuries had said about it, he's now sharing with them, and here's what the Greek behind that verse is. Here's where that Latin translation that we're all familiar with might have missed a couple of things. Because Erasmus's New Testament was about 500 pages, because he did in just the New Testament, he did the Greek text, and then he did his own new classical humanist translation. And then he did 500 pages of notes defending and discussing how he differed from Jerome. So it's 1,000 pages total. And we know Luther had a copy. Galatians, Hebrews, and of course by this time, by the fall of 1517, we're into the controversy over indulgences. And that's the 95. This is from the Luther movie, which you haven't seen. I highly recommend to you. This is a scene where one of the townspeople comes back to Wittenberg, and she's very excited because she had gone to a neighboring town. A neighboring town and bought an indulgence from an indulgence seller. The Elector of Saxony would not allow the indulgences to be sold in Wittenberg. Maybe doing the right thing for the wrong reason. Maybe because it competed with his collection of relics that he collected money for. If you wanted to go in and see his collection of relics, you had to pay him. He didn't want people spending money on an indulgence seller when they could pay money to see his collection of relics. Anyway, the indulgences couldn't be sold in Wittenberg, but people in the city were making the hike. You know, a day's walk away, you could find an indulgence seller and buy one from them. So the movie depicts a scene that almost certainly happened. One of the townspeople came back with an indulgence and was showing it off to him and say, "Look, I bought an indulgence for myself and for my daughter." And he's like, "No, you've misunderstood." And so not only as a professor of theology, but also as a pastor of the townspeople, he feels the need to speak up and say, this is wrong. And initially it's like, I can't believe the Pope is letting these people do this. Surely if the Pope knew what these people were doing, he would put a stop to it. And he's rather rudely brought up short and shocked to discover that not only does the Pope know what they're doing, the Pope has authorized what they're doing. It's part of a church building project, and they're raising money to build a new St. Peter's in Rome. There they are. Printed in 1570. This is a copy that was printed in 1517 in Nuremberg. The printers figured out very quickly, this is like the early modern version of Twitter, because this could be printed on one page, front and back. And the printers could then sell the one printed page for a couple of pennies each and make money. And so Nuremberg, not only Wittenberg, every one of the 100 German imperial cities has a printing press. And all the printers are like, oh, we can make money. We can all make money. The idea of copyright isn't known yet. So everybody who gets a copy says, oh, quick, come here. Get the type out. Let's set up the press. Let's print copies and send them out and hawk them on the street corners. We can make money. And so it goes viral. This is the early 16th century version of a meme or a tweet going viral and being reposted, repeated, and disseminated all across Europe. Luther is the master of the essay and the short, pithy, well, I'll give you some samples of the things that he wrote later on. He would have loved Twitter. It would have been right up his alley, and he would say things that would embarrass all of us. Because he wrote essays that still embarrass all of us. But he has a kind of a wicked sense of humor and a very pithy way of phrasing things. And so he becomes the most prolific author in Europe. This is in 1520. These are the essays that he writes and publishes in 1520. Treatise on Good Works, The Papacy of Rome, An Address to the Christian Nobility of the German Nation, The Freedom of a Christian, The Babylonian Captivity of the Church. There are a couple of estimates from the 1520s that of all the books and titles printed through all the 100 imperial cities in Germany, Luther accounts for 20% of all the books published over a decade. 1/5 of all the books in Germany that the printing presses are turning out are written by Luther. And the papacy in Rome doesn't know how to react. They don't have anybody who is this eloquent or this nimble or this vicious in attack. So he is denounced by the church authorities. He's denounced by the Archbishop of Mainz, who's got a deal with the Pope. They're splitting the proceeds of the indulgence sales 50-50. The Archbishop of Mainz gets half of it goes to Rome. In Rome, they're using it to raise money to build a new St. Peter's. The Archbishop of Mainz is using it to pay back his debts because he had purchased 3 bishoprics, which violated canon law, and he had to pay all kinds of bribes to everybody. And he borrowed the money to do it from the Fuggers. So he's got to pay them back. So his half is going to the Fuggers, and the Pope's half is going to build the new St. Peter's, which is the one you can visit today. It's the largest church in the world. They had to build a new St. Peter's in Rome because those rich merchants in Florence had built the biggest church in the world. And it's just not right that the biggest church in the world should be in Florence. The biggest church in the world should be in Rome. And the Pope who's undertaking this project just happens to be Leo X, but before he was Leo X, his name is Giovanni de' Medici. He's the head of the Medici family from Florence. He's like, yeah, we got to build a bigger church. Well, to build a bigger church will take a lot of money. It is still the largest church in the world. They're very proud. If you walk through St. Peter's in Rome, along the main aisle, the main nave, they have marked in the floor of the church where the other churches would end. So here's where the cathedral in Milan ends. Here's where the Cathedral of St. John's in New York City ends. Here, and you keep walking past the boundaries of the smaller churches that St. Peter's in Rome is bigger than. So Luther is denounced, but he is not sent to Rome as a prisoner to be tried as a heretic because he has the protection of the Elector of Saxony. Because he's very proud of his university and he's very proud of his professor. Even if he might not agree with everything that his professor has said or written, he's very proud of the fact that he's making the university in Wittenberg famous. It's not an old university. It's not like Oxford or Paris or Bologna. Wittenberg University is like a little community college. It's only about 10 years old. And all of a sudden, it's the place that everybody is talking about. And the Elector of Saxony kind of likes that. He says, no, I'm not sending Luther to Rome to be tried for heresy. They just execute him. And so he approaches the emperor, who is a very young, at the very first meeting, Charles V, only 21 years old. And he approaches the emperor and says, your grandfather, who preceded you as emperor, promised that no German would be sent to Rome to be put on trial, that any citizen of the empire would get a trial in Germany. So I'm going to stand on that promise from your grandfather. Luther should be tried in Germany. Charles, who's brand new in his office, says, okay, we'll do that. Luther will be summoned to a meeting of all the German nobles in the little city of Worms, and we'll put him on trial there. Well, the Catholic Church doesn't want a trial. They basically gather all of his books and say, there's only one question that we want Dr. Luther to answer. Do you renounce the books that you have written? Because the Pope has already declared them to be heretical. So do you recant of the heresy that you have written? And Luther says, I need time to think about that. And goes back to his lodging, comes back the next day. They ask the same question, do you recant? And he said, my books are not all of the same sort. Some of them are simple Christian devotional material, which everybody, even my opponents, agrees is helpful and useful for the Christian life. It would be foolish for me to denounce those. Some of my books have attacked the doctrines of the church and the indulgence sellers, and I confess sometimes I might have been a little bit too harsh, but I'm human. I can make a mistake. Show me where I've made a mistake, and I'll retract. If you can show me from Scripture and reason, not or, and, if you can show me from Scripture and reason where I have made a mistake, I'll retract. He said, but then there are my books which have attacked the papacy and the captivity of the Christians and the foul practices of the indulgence sellers. He said, to denounce and recant from those would be to aid the devil. So, here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. And the Pope's representative says he's declared himself a heretic. He's guilty, obviously, of heresy, but the emperor had given him a safe conduct to come to Wittenberg. And the emperor says, I will honor the safe conduct. Luther was not sure he would, but the emperor says, I will honor the safe conduct. But he is a heretic, and we will declare him a heretic and impose an imperial ban. Basically says anybody in the empire should seize him and bring him to justice. Well, the elector's not going to let that happen, but the elector is actually a fairly clever fellow himself. On the way home from Worms to Wittenberg, Luther in a wagon with just a driver and another monk who had accompanied him is suddenly surrounded by a group of 30 men on horseback who come out of the woods and demand to know which one of you is Martin Luther. And Luther won't let the monk who's with him take his place and says, I'm Luther. They tie Luther's hands, throw a canvas sack over his head, put him on the back of a horse, and they ride off into the woods. And for weeks and then months, all anybody knows about Luther is he was on his way home, he was attacked and kidnapped by men on horseback. Nobody knows where he is. We don't know whether it was the Pope's men or a Catholic nobleman, or we don't know who. Well, they had taken him to a castle that belonged to the Elector of Saxony. It had been arranged by the Elector of Saxony for Luther's protection. And they hid him at the Wartburg Castle up on top of a mountain near not Eisleben, but forgot the name of the city now. Eisenstadt, I think. And he used his time, he asked them to send his books from Wittenberg, his copy of Erasmus's Greek New Testament, a Greek grammar, and a Greek dictionary. And in about 4 months, he translated every book of the New Testament from Greek into German. And in 1522, just as he leaves the castle and goes back to Wittenberg, the printers begin printing copies of a German New Testament. Now, there had been some German New Testaments before, but they've been translated from the Vulgate, from the Latin. Luther's is translated from the Greek. It's the first German translation directly from the Greek. And the Luther Bible, the Luther New Testament in particular, does for the German language what the King James Bible did for the English language. The same way we talk about King James English and Shakespearean English, the Luther Bible is the standard of early modern German. And all of the familiar phrases, the Beatitudes, the Corinthians chapter 13 chapter, all of the parts of the New Testament that are very familiar to us, and familiar to us in the form of the King James translation, are familiar to the Germans in the Luther translation. So I teach high school German, and one of the things I do with my year 2 students when we finish grammar is we start translating chapters of the Luther Bible. Because you can really get a feel and a flavor. And he said his goal was to write the Bible in good Saxon German such that any Saxon housewife could read it and understand it. It's very similar to Tyndale's idea when he started translating the Bible into English. Tyndale was inspired by Luther. In fact, the charge against Tyndale when he does an English translation of the New Testament is that he's done a Luther Bible in English. Which is essentially what he had done. Yeah, there's the trial. So here's the Pope's representative, here's the emperor, here's the imperial herald, here are some of the electors, here are Luther's books laid out on the table basically saying, do you recant? Are these your books? The Pope has declared them to contain heresy. Do you recant? And it takes a day, but Luther eventually says, no, I do not. So yeah, outlawed, kidnapped, hidden at the Wartburg Castle, only for a year. He returns to Wittenberg, he publishes that New Testament, goes back to lecturing at the university, begins working on a translation of the Old Testament, gets married, 1534 the whole Bible comes out. He dies in 1546, February 18th. Yeah, there's the Bible. That's very, very beautiful, printed. This is a facsimile, but taken from photographs of one of the original copies with these illustrations. Every book of the New Testament begins with a color plate. And many of the color plates and illustrations were done by Lucas Cranach, who's the court painter in Wittenberg. and a friend of Luther and the Elector, and eventually one of the witnesses at Luther's wedding and godfather to his children. And then, of course, every book begins with a very ornate capital letter. These are printed in black ink, and then the colors are added by hand before they're published. So you don't make multiple passes through the press. You print a black ink version that you then have the workshop of artists actually do the color work. So this is Im Anfang war das Wort, und das Wort war bei Gott, und Gott war das Wort. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and God was the Word. John chapter 1. And this is not, Tyndale has this, and Tyndale is fluent in German, as well as Latin and Greek. We talked about the 95 Theses. Let's talk about some of the individual ones, because you can get from some of these pithy little, this is like Twitter. Each of these is like a tweet. So thesis number 1, when our Lord and Master Jesus Christ said, repent, he called for the entire life of believers to be one of penitence. Not a rote mechanical once a week before Mass observance, but something that characterized your life. Thesis 21. Hence, those who preach indulgences are in error when they say that a man is absolved and saved from every penalty by the Pope's indulgence. There is no divine authority for preaching that the soul flies out of the purgatory immediately the money clinks in the bottom of the chest. That's actually a little saying that rhymes in German. And that's the way they were being sold. You know, buy an indulgence for your grandfather who's otherwise suffering in purgatory, but if you can just, buy an indulgence, we can apply it to his credit, and as soon as you buy it, he'll go straight up to heaven. And when the money clinks in the chest, the soul will fly to its rest. That's the way they were being sold. Luther says, no, there's no authority for that. Christians should be taught that one who gives to the poor or lends to the needy does a better action than if he purchases indulgences. I should do this on my Twitter account. I should start sending out the theses one at a time. Yeah. Freedom of a Christian. This is his thesis. This is the way he opens up this essay. A Christian man is the most free lord of all and subject to none. Semicolon. A Christian man is the most dutiful servant of all and subject to everyone. And then he spends about 20 or 30 pages examining and expanding on that paradox. A Christian man is the most free lord of all, and a Christian man is the most dutiful servant of all. This is one of my favorite little passages from The Freedom of a Christian. He talks about the benefits of faith. He says, the third incomparable benefit of faith is that it unites the soul with Christ as a bride is united with her bridegroom. By this mystery, as the apostle teaches, Christ and the soul become one flesh. And if they are one flesh, and there is between them a true marriage, indeed the most perfect of all marriages, since human marriages are but poor examples of this one true marriage, it follows that everything they have, they hold in common, the good as well as the evil. Accordingly, the believing soul can boast of and glory in whatever Christ has, as though it were its own. And whatever the soul has, Christ claims as his own. This is before he got married. He elevates, by the way, the institution of marriage in a way that nobody had done for centuries. The ideal of a monk who takes a perpetual vow of chastity to remain single had been elevated in the church as the highest form of Christian devotion. Luther takes marriage and says, no. The Pope is not worthy to know how much joy there is in a marriage. Let us compare these, and we shall see inestimable benefits. Christ is full of grace, life, and salvation. The soul is full of sin, death, and damnation. Now, let faith come between them, and sin's, death, and damnation will be Christ's, while grace, life, and salvation will be the soul's. For if he is a husband, he must needs take to himself that which is his wife's, and at the same time impart to his wife that which is his. For in giving her his own body and himself, how can he but give her all that is his? And in taking to himself the body of his wife, how can he but take to himself all that is hers? It's really quite astonishing. Every Christian is by faith so exalted above all things that in spiritual power he is completely Lord of all things, so that nothing whatever can do him any hurt. Yea, all things are subject to him and are compelled to be subservient to his salvation. Thus, Paul says, all things work together for good to those who are called, who are the called. By the way, the Romans 8:28 is a modern editor's edition. There were no verse numbers in any Bible until the 1550s. And also, whether life or death or things present or things to come, all are yours and you are Christ's. And again, the citation is helpfully added by a modern editor. One of the amusing things I discovered when I was in grad school is that modern scholars don't know the Bible nearly as well as Luther does, because Luther's translated every verse. He studied the Greek text of every verse. And so when Luther writes an essay, he's just sprinkling biblical allusions through every page. And he doesn't always give a citation. And so there are lots of biblical quotations in Luther's essays that modern readers miss. They don't realize they're from the Bible. I've read some academic articles critiquing Luther's theology who hold him out as having invented all these extravagant doctrines, and then they pull out a piece from his essay, and I'm reading the articles when I was in grad school, and I go, that's not Luther, that's the New Testament. But Luther didn't provide a citation, so the modern academic didn't recognize that it was a quote from the Bible. He thought Luther's making this stuff up, and it's crazy. It's like, oh, Luther's not making it up. He's quoting Paul because he knows Paul forward and backward. In the experience of life, we see that we are subject to all things and suffer many things, even death. Yea, the more of a Christian any man is, so many the more evils, sufferings, and deaths is he subject, as we see in the first place in Christ, the firstborn, and all his holy brethren. Not a prosperity gospel. Now, Adam had been created by God just and righteous, so that he could not have needed to be justified and made righteous by keeping the garden and working in it, but that he might not be unemployed, God gave him the business of keeping and cultivating paradise. These would have indeed been works of perfect freedom, being done for no object but that of pleasing God, and not in order to obtain justification, which he already had to the full, and which would have been innate in all of us, but for the fall. Good works do not make a good man, but a good man does good works. Bad works do not make a bad man, but a bad man does bad works. Well, I could go on. That Luther is eminently quotable. And just a word should be said about his patron and protector, Frederick the Wise, Duke of Saxony, Elector of the Holy Roman Empire, who insisted that he liked his little professor of theology and he didn't want to see him burned as a heretic. Thank you very much. And to whom Luther dedicated his translation of the New Testament. And there she is, Katharina. He had been a monk for 20 years when he got married. She had been a nun for 10. They had 6 children, married for 21 years. Katie died 6 years after Martin at the age of 53. Oh, and she apparently had quite an excellent singing voice, and Luther played the lute. And she brewed beer. We have a couple of letters from Luther to Katy. He's out going through Saxony, visiting various towns and churches and preaching and advising nobility on reforming their church. And he writes a letter to Katy and he said, please send me a barrel of your beer. The beer here is terrible. Yep. Luther Bibel, 1534. That's a statue in the square in Wittenberg, a statue of Luther, and he's holding his German New Testament. So when you pray for wife or children or parents or the magistrates, this is what you should think. This work I have been commanded to do, and as an obedient person, I must do it. On my account, it would be nothing, but on account of the commandment, it is a precious thing. This is Luther's grave marker in the Castle Church in Wittenberg. And the rose became his symbol, so somebody puts a rose there every day. I could say a lot more. I could go on and on and on, but that, I hope, gives you a bit of an introduction to him and his significance and a bit of his style and flavor. We're going to come back next month, and I want to talk about the great musical composer Johann Sebastian Bach, who is very much a Lutheran, very much the great Protestant Lutheran composer, and who writes religious opera. He writes opera music in the 1700s that rivals anything the Italians are doing. And I'll play you some pieces. I've in particular come to be just hugely a fan of his St. Matthew Passion, which is a 3-hour religious drama. It was written to be performed on Good Friday, and it just tells the story of Jesus' last week of the Passion, from the Last Supper to his death and burial, and it ends with Jesus' body being placed in the tomb. And when performed, as it still is, everybody remains silent. It requires a full chamber orchestra, 3 or 4 choirs, an organist, soloists. You have soloists who sing the entire text of the last couple of chapters of the Gospel of Matthew is set to music. He intersperses hymns that the congregation can sing with. He does the hymn, O Sacred Head Once Wounded, that we know. He does it in 6 different keys and puts different verses in at various points in the opera. And it ends on an unresolved, dissonant chord, the very last sound. And the tradition is, when it's performed, nobody speaks, nobody applauds. Everyone in the congregation stands and exits because it's Good Friday. And they come back on Sunday to celebrate the resurrection. So I'll play, we don't have time. It's a 3-hour piece. But it is just astonishing. And I'll play you some excerpts from it when we come back next month. And then the final lecture for this winter series is Bradford and Winthrop. We're going to carry the history of the church across the Atlantic into New England, and it's definitely New England. They thought of themselves as Englishmen, but they were trying to complete the Reformation. And the Pilgrims came first, and then the Puritans 10 years later. So the Pilgrims came in 1620, the Puritans came in 1630. We'll talk about the differences and what the background of these two guys were, because it's very interesting. Winthrop, who was the governor of the Puritan colony, was a trained lawyer and had been elected to the local shire government. Bradford was a religious refugee. He had led a band that had had to flee England from persecution because they were nonconformists. They had separated themselves from the Church of England. So they fled to the Netherlands first. And then they were alarmed because their kids were growing up and beginning to learn Dutch and speak Dutch and to begin going to the Dutch Reformed Church, which was kind of like, yeah, but we don't want to lose our identity as Englishmen. So they said, well, we have to go somewhere else. So we'll talk about those stories as well.
Walks like a Dutch, quacks like a Dutch.
Yeah.
Why is Luther considered anti-Semitic?
Oh, well, it's a bit like asking, why is Trump considered mean? Luther wrote some essays that are thoroughly embarrassing, especially toward the end of his life. He wrote a couple of essays attacking the Jews in their synagogues and their lies. Someone had repeated to him that a local rabbi had said that Jesus was the product of an affair between Mary and a Roman soldier, and they had to cover it up. And that's how Christianity got started. And Luther was just outraged. Luther had been raised a Catholic. And, you know, his devotion to Mary was rooted in Scripture and the Magnificat and, you know, the early chapters of Luke. Hail Mary, full of grace, that's not invented medieval liturgy, that's from Luke. That's Elizabeth saying, blessed are you among women. That's Elizabeth to Mary in the Gospel of Luke. And so Luther's just outraged, and he says we should shut their synagogues down, we shouldn't tolerate them, we should run them all out of Saxony. Well, of course, fast forward several centuries, and that got picked up and used. I'm sure Luther regrets having written those essays now. I'm convinced Luther somewhere is shaking his head going, I should never have written that one. He wrote so much, and that one is not defensible. You know, I would not even begin to try and excuse what he wrote. What he wrote was just wrong, and he shouldn't have written it, but he did. And so the people who say he was anti-Semitic point to that. It's not true. He did write it, and he did say terrible things in it about the Jews, and he recommended that terrible actions be taken by the rulers of Saxony. But he was never in a position to put any of those things into effect, and nobody ever took him seriously and did it. He was never a magistrate. He never held any authority in civil government. He was a university professor and a writer and a pastor. And he had written earlier things that were more favorable to the Jews. He wrote in the 1520s when he was much younger. He said, I don't blame the Jews for not converting to Christianity. The Catholic Church has so obscured the gospel they've never heard it. And he had some contact with rabbis in Saxony. And for one thing, they helped him with his Hebrew. And he seems to have held out the hope that if he could just explain the gospel to them, freed from all the trappings of late medieval Catholic practice, that they would see the truth of the gospel and they would convert. And of course they didn't. And so he's disappointed. And then somebody insulted his mother. So that's the thing. Somebody called his mother ugly names, and so he reacted with a really bad. Emotionally, his tie to Mary is, as if you would insult his mother. If you insult Mary, he feels that emotionally, as if you had called into question the honor of his mother. So he writes a horrible essay, and it's true. He wrote it. Can't defend it. Wish he hadn't written it. It does not characterize his life. It does not characterize where he focused his attention. It was not, he was a cranky old man with kidney stones. That's all you can say. And often in pain. Questions? Comments?
How much time from the Gutenberg Bible to the Wittenberg Bible?
Gutenberg publishes the printed Bible in 1455. The New Testament that Luther did with the printer Hans Luft is 1522. So it's 60 years. It's only 60 years from Gutenberg to this, and then 12 years later to this. And there's a whole book here. This is a whole collection of essays about Wittenberg Bible printing of the Reformation times. These are a whole series of essays. There were 3 different printing presses in Wittenberg. Most other large cities in Europe only had one. In Wittenberg, there were 3 printing presses, and they couldn't keep up with Luther. He wrote essays faster than they could set type.
In 1521, when he was abducted and hid in the castle for a year, but then he went back in 1522. What changed in the meantime? because if the Pope and the Emperor all wanted him arrested in 1521, why did he feel safe to come back into public life and resume being a professor in 1522?
Several of the German territories had followed his advice and begun reforming their churches. The first prince to do it is the Prince of Hesse. The Elector of Saxony actually doesn't reform the church in Saxony as fast as the prince in Hesse. And the German imperial cities have all gone over. So that in that 1 year period, there's been this preference cascade, really is the only way to describe it, where almost all of the 100 imperial cities have said, Luther's right, that's the way we should be operating our church. We repudiate the Pope in Rome. We no longer recognize him as the head of the church. So the Pope had effectively lost the allegiance of a huge part of the German Empire. The German Empire winds up split between Protestant and Catholic. In some ways it still is. Bavaria is still Catholic. The Rhineland is still Catholic. Saxony, Brandenburg, Prussia are very Protestant. In fact, even as far down as the 19th century, at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, when Prussia had beaten the French, and the rest of Germany decides we need to get together and form a larger union, the Chancellor of Prussia is like, I'm not sure we want to let these people in because we're Protestant and they're Catholic. So Bismarck almost rejected the application of the other German states to join with Prussia to form Germany because he said, yeah, I don't know about those guys have a different culture from us. So yeah, in 1 year, public opinion changed to the point that Luther had to be careful where he went. He never really went outside of the domain of Saxony. When he travels around, he writes letters to everybody. He does not travel outside of Saxony, where he's protected.
People supported him, that not even the Emperor sent people after him because that
Yeah.
could
The Elector in Saxony is just not going to permit it. And the emperor winds up at war with his, plus the emperor is distracted because there is a threat by the Turks on Vienna and a threat by the French. And so the emperor is distracted by war with the King of France and an attack by the Turks. And he kind of needs all of the princes of Germany to assist him in repelling those two military threats. Even the Protestant prince, he gets to begrudgingly say, yeah, okay, I need your troops, guys. And they go, you got to let us change the church in our territory. You want us to come help you out fighting the King of France or fighting the Ottoman Emperor? Then you got to let us do our thing with our churches. And the emperor's like, all right, fine, we'll talk about that later. Bring your troops and help me. And so Luther is free. Luther is free for all those reasons. There's a popular preference cascade, the protection of the Elector of Saxony, and the distraction of the emperor by the Ottoman Turks and the King of France. All right. Well, it's 7 o'clock.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. I look forward to seeing you all again next month.